I could probably talk as long as Claudia, but not nearly as eloquently, so I'm just going to leave the stage and turn things over to your leaders.
Now I'd like to turn to Loris Taylor. She's with Native Public Media to introduce our speaker.
My name is Loris Taylor. I am the President and CEO of Native Public Media. I am from the Hopi Indian tribe of northeastern Arizona. And I'm here to introduce our dynamic speaker tonight, but before that, I just want to say that I truly believe that Native people have a right to communicate through their arts, through their dance, history, culture, and self-governance. And to realize this, we at Native Public Media work hard to overcome the digital and media divides that pervade Indian country. And we do this by securing broadcast licenses, by providing digital literacy and journalism, and by advocating for public policy that will remove the barriers and challenges that still exist in telecommunications law, rules, and regulations here in the United States. In 2004, we started out with knowing that broadband penetration across Indian country was less than 10%. And that 1 in 3 families in Indian country had access to analog telephone. And today we have 53 broadcast facilities across the U.S. that are Native owned and operated. 11 of those stations are streaming their programming on the internet every day, reaching people around the globe. We included tribal provisions in the U.S. National Broadband Plan, but we still have a long road ahead of us. In order to really realize our telecommunications destiny. And so one of our strongest allies in this work has been the National Congress of American Indians. It's the oldest and most prestigious membership of elected tribal leaders in the United States. And at the helm of this powerful organization is a woman who is fierce, who is competent, dedicated, and trusted. She has a really impressive bio, which I'm not going to read to you tonight, but I want to tell you something about her that's not in her bio. She is our ambassador to the White House. She is our liaison to Congress and many of the federal agencies and state governments. She is also our voice before the United Nations, and she does the heavy lifting along with her team before tribal leaders sit to the table with the President of the United States and congressional leaders. And she is someone I deeply admire. I ask that once you welcome her to the podium, that you imagine yourself to be in a tribal longhouse or kiva, by silencing your cell phones and by allowing yourselves to be still for at least 10 minutes so that you can hear her words. Ladies and gentlemen, I present the Executive Director of the National Congress of American Indians, member of the Raven Sockeye Clan of the Tlingit Nation, Jacqueline Johnson Peda.
Kunashish kusin yu hatta wasak suka adi ayahat kagwantan yadi yeshidak. In my own language, I introduced myself as most of us normally would. And in my language, I said my Tlingit name is Kusin. It actually was given to me by my clan leader. It was his mother's name. I come from the Raven House, the Raven Sockeye House, and I come from Daeshu, a small village in Alaska, which means the end of the trail. But, you know, in non-native terms, they call it Haines, Alaska. So it really is an honor to be able to be here today, and I also want to thank Loris for inviting me to be able to be here and share with you. She too is a champion. she has championed so many things and is actually the chair of our telecommunications committee at NCAI and is pushing forward technology to advance tribal leaders across the country. It's an honor to be here in LA. It's the home of tribal nations, the Chumash, the Morongo, and the San Manuel tribes, as well as 111 other tribes in California. And so I'd like to welcome you here to a land of tribal nations. Like so many other tribal members, we're feeling a great resurgence of our cultural values, our traditions, and our language. And so on Monday night, when I got done with work, I rushed home because Monday night was the night of my language class, my virtual language class. And so I rushed so I could get on the internet and connect to my community at home in Alaska. And I'm actually joined the university there so I could be online to go to school with them. And as part of this class, and in the class I had a group of high school students in a small village of Hoona, Alaska. I have a retired teacher from Cake, Alaska that's in the class. We have the instructor who's from Sitka, and she has a small group sitting with her. And then I'm joined by my daughter who lives in Maryland, and another lady who lives in Anchorage. And we all come together in a community to be able to practice our language, to be able to sustain our language, because it's one of those indigenous languages that is dying. But what a joy it gives us all to be able to come together as a community. And then, of course, we have to kind of deal with the technology challenges. So we tried Google Hangout, and then we realized that the pixelation in some of the places that comes from our small communities doesn't really work well for being able to do the articulation of our language. And then we realized that all of us needed to have a Dropbox so that we could actually put all our lesson material in there. And that meant that you had to actually really be able to have internet sustained connection to be able to access it. And so then sometimes we just revert to the plain old telephone. And then we realized when we use the plain old telephone that there's something that I didn't really know this, but actually because our tonnage is longer, and so when the words cut off quicker on the telephone than it does with the way that we say something like, Latsine, for example. And so it comes across different over a telephone. But my tribe is like a lot of tribes in the country who are seeing that not only is the internet providing access, but it really is the equalizer. And the opportunity for us to be able to provide and participate in global markets, whether it's with our native arts and crafts, or whether it's from Santa Fe, or whether it's the bison jerky that is being produced by the Great Sioux Nations, or whether it's that access to transformative education, virtual education, being provided through our tribal colleges, or the critical telemedicine that's being done in Alaska. But with the internet, as you guys know, because this is what you guys do, comes all kinds of questions. And as tribal leaders, we're in the same boat. We're trying to figure out how to make our own policies. It just seems like yesterday that I was actually, when I was in the Clinton administration during that time period, and we went to take into some of the tribal communities their very first public computer with internet access. And we were actually having to have conversations with tribal leaders, particularly in the Pueblos, debating whether or not they actually wanted to be able to have the public to have access or have internet access in their communities. And so now, from that point, which wasn't that long ago, we're now dealing with policies and issues of spectrum and cell tower placements and intellectual property protections and portability and protections from sacred places being mapped on the internet and virtual maps, and internet security, just like all other governments. And the only challenge is, too many times, tribal governments aren't at the policy-making table. So as I was stated in my introduction, I work for National Congress of American Indians. And it's an organization that was created in 1944, and it's an institution of tribal governments. And that represent autonomous sovereign nations. And so this institution was created in 1944 when the US government was trying to pass several pieces of legislation to legally terminate tribes. And although many of you may know about some of the grim history about the indigenous peoples in North America, one thing had always remained was that the sovereign rights and the governments of tribal nations was always recognized. Even so, that in the US Constitution, it recognized tribal governments as sovereign nations. So this act in 1944 to actually legally terminate the rights of tribes really brought together, the tribes were very, very concerned and came together and they said, we absolutely recognize there's a point that we have to have representation in Washington, D.C. We have to be able to educate policy leaders and decision makers. We have to be able to be there to have our eyes and ears in Washington, D.C. to protect our rights. So that when policy decisions were made, that tribal leaders were actually at the table. Today, not much has changed. NCAI still advocates for the rights of tribal leadership and tribal governments. And to be able to make sure that as tribal governments, our rights and our rights are protected, and that we still sit at the table for policy discussions and recognize the contributions of our governments in the larger family of American governments. So in preparation for today's speech, I reflected upon telecommunications and what's happening in Indian country. And it's a complex area with a mixed history of success. So just generally, really quickly give you a little bit of demographics. We have a population of 5.2 million people. We comprise less than 2% of the United States population. But our communities are young and growing. Native populations have grown by 27% in the last decade compared to 10%, the 10% increase of the US population overall. So we have a strong segment of Native youth. 32% of our population is under the age of 18. What I think is this provides us a great opportunity to guide and to mentor our young next leaders, and to recognize that those leaders are growing up in a place and part of a population who's experimenting with new technologies and are very much a part of the way that they will communicate and the way that they see the world and how they connect to the rest of the world. So if we look at that and where Indian country is today, and just looking at the 2000 US Census, and Laura alluded to some of these statistics, but it's estimated that Indian country had 10% of tribal lands had access to the internet. And that just 68% of tribal households had access to a basic telephone service. So when you take those statistics and you take our growing population, and it's no wonder why tribal leaders were concerned. And so tribal leaders, as they did in the past, came together and said we need to advocate for our futures, particularly around telecom policy. That we want to be able to make these policies bridge the digital divide on our lands. And so during that time, we went to the government. We were able to make sure that we got this Office of Tribal Nations Affairs in the FCC, and we started to ask for regulations that address issues of access. And we've done a lot of things that have actually created to be able to help us start to address these challenges in our communities. So many tribes now have first-time connections to the internet through their Indian healthcare service programs. They're federal programs that provide healthcare service, and also through their tribal schools, their public safety facilities, and their government buildings. But residential service still remains a challenge. And the drive of market forces still hasn't reached many of our communities. Neither has the connection on most of our lands. So, frustrated by the surroundings of the non-tribal providers and their refusal to provide service on our lands, a number of tribes, as Laura mentioned, decided that they were going to take it upon themselves to create their own companies. And one of those phone companies was actually created in 1988, the Gila River Indian community of Arizona, They have 372 acres of reservation on, and they sit adjacent to the 10th largest city in the nation, Phoenix, Arizona. And by that time, the tribal citizens there wanted to have access to basic phone service, something that everybody would want to have in this day and age. And some of their members were quoted figures of like $10,000 for a basic installation. So due to those high costs, the surrounding communication providers said, you know, we can't afford to build out to this tribal reservation, to the Gila River's reservation, and so the tribal citizens couldn't afford this basic utility. And leaving in their community only about 10 to 20% of phones having telephone penetration. And also, what the other big challenge is, also creating problems for emergency personnel when they were going to respond to violent crimes and other public safety concerns on the reservation. So today, Gila River created their own telephone service. They provide the residential and business services on the reservation, and their rates have jumped to 80% access. Not only that, they provide high-speed internet and is the economic engine for prosperity in their community. So Gila River is just one of the success stories in Indian country trying to address the digital divide. But many tribes are using the sophisticated broadband networks to create jobs and tribal businesses and tourism using the World Wide Web. Tribes like the Chickasaw Nation of Oklahoma have invested heavily in their technology. In fact, they have one of the great internet TV channels. And so you can learn a lot about Indian country just by going to Chickasaw Nation's website. But their dedication to the networks only has benefited their people, but it has actually really helped them with their overall economic development. They're a stronghold in Oklahoma. They provide $2.4 billion to that state's economy. However, secure networks and website portals serve as the first line of defense in protecting our sensitive citizens and their economic information. And issues around cybersecurity remain a constant concern for tribes entering into this digital world. While our entry to the telecom world is more recent than others domestically and even across the globe, tribal nations stand ready to tackle those challenges. So another example of our people harnessing the power of the internet has been really in the use of social media networks. In fact, we used to say in Indian country, you know, it was the moccasin telegraph, you know, everybody knew what was going on, but now it's Facebook. And we all know what's going on, but through those platforms, we've really been able to use our voices and to express in our stories, to be able to provide more education about who we are as tribal governments, to be able to provide solutions to the global audience. When the UN came together to talk about global warming and issues related to the security of our environment, Indigenous peoples were able to engage in a way that they hadn't been able to engage before. So it's through these development and all these partnerships that we're able to see the possibilities. And all we're saying is that when you bring tribal governments and Indigenous peoples and you include them with other policymakers in setting forums such as this, you have a connected society which is truly representative of the diverse global society. Our kids, our young children, whether they be from a small village in Alaska or from a larger reservation in the Navajo Nation or from anywhere else in the world, want to be just as connected to the global society, still be able to celebrate our celebrations, to retain our language, to share our heritage, to be who we are, but be part of the global society. We thank you for considering us and bringing us to the table. Gunesh Chish, Gunesh Chish Hako.
Truly inspiring. I'd like to call to our incoming chair for ALAC, Alan Greenberg.
Steve thought he had a problem following Fatty. As you know, I'm the incoming chair, and I was assigned a task of thanking the sponsors and giving 2 minutes to do that. I think that's a test to see if I could actually talk in 2 minutes. I'm tempted to go on for the next hour, and they'll reject me, and I won't have to do this, but I won't do that. Or maybe I will. When Glenn started talking about this event, I was one of the ones who said, are we really going to find sponsors to do yet another event? And good thing I didn't succeed in talking him out of it. And Glenn and his team has done a fine job. I'd like to thank Afilias, I'd like to thank VeriSign and Native Public Media for sponsoring this event. Allowing us to be here.
Desiree, can you please come up? Desiree is with Afilias, and I have to point to the gentleman that's the outgoing chair, who's largely responsible for raising the funds, so I don't want to take any of that credit, so he's been done a great job. Desiree?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Glenn and Alan, for that introduction. And good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to sponsor another Naralo event. The previous one was in Toronto, and my chairman's co-sponsor with Google. But I'm really happy to be here and to thank everyone for the invitation to be on this land and the native people and the landowners for hosting this event. In addition